Morning, everyone. So back on the Subaru, and I got the bell housing bolts out, the torque converter bolts out, the starter out of the way, and the heater hoses off. I'm going to show you what I got. So here it is, pretty simple and straightforward. Like I said, there's the opening where you can see the torque converter torque converter bolt access holes. What I did was I hooked up a chain. I got it to this head here. This bolt hole is already used for the alternator AC bracket. So basically I just reuse that one. Now this bolt on this head, it's basically the same bolt, it's the same head, they just swap sides. That bolt, that hole is never used, so I actually ran a tap down to clean the threads up because I didn't want to just ramshackle a bolt down in the hole, because I like to do things the right way. So there we go, I got the chain. I already separated it. You can see it's separated there. I have a jack stand underneath the bell housing portion, or the differential portion of this right now. So I'm going to let the lift down and let you look at that while I do that. Let's do this. Focus in. Okay. So now you'll see as the car comes down, the whole thing will lift up. There, it lifted up. Now it's separated quite a bit there. So now I can get the hoist and I can pluck this thing out. Now the two lower bolts that go from the block through the bell housing, they're actually studs. I don't know if you could see it from up here. So that's one of the main reasons you have to have this thing elevated so much. Oh, there, you can just see it there. And that stud, I mean, it's got to go through, I'd say like 1.5 inches of cast aluminum first before this thing will clear coming out. So that's the reason you have to have it jacked up so much, so the motor mounts will clear and then this thing will come out. So let me get the engine hoist and let me yank this thing out of its little house there, its little cubby. Alright, so I just want to show you this too, now that I got it separated out. There's those studs down below, and it's kind of hard to tell from the video, but the engine winds up going almost flat as you're pulling it out, whereas the transmission's at a slight angle. So the studs, when they go in, they have to go in at an angle like this. So usually what you do is you get them in at a point like this, and you got to like lift the motor up slightly so it pitches, and then as it's going in, you slowly lower the motor down to get it back in place. So going back together is a little more of a pain in the neck than it is coming apart. So that's about that. Yeah, our torque converter didn't come out, which is good. So I'm going to yank this thing completely out now. You don't have to take the hoods off of these as long as you have the chain tight enough. So hopefully I do, and I should clear. So let me get on with taking that out. And you can watch some of this. It's about as exciting as watching paint dry, but you get the idea. So I'm coming out with it, and I'll get it out and on a stand. Or actually, probably on a roll cart or something, because these things are pretty light. Alright guys, so there you go. That little tiny flat motor right there. It's up, it's out, it's hanging out. And let's slide it out. There it goes. So, let's see. There's that plate I was telling you about behind the flywheel that always leaks on these things. So, it's normally not the rear main seal. This one actually looks like it might have case halves leaking. Let's see. Alright, we're going to get the flywheel off and take a look. Doesn't matter. I'm going to reseal everything anyway. And we're going to go from there. So, but yeah, this little tin cover, this has a tendency to leak in the corner down here and pour oil out. And then the problem is trying to separate it, it winds up getting distorted. So you replace it. They are available. And I have a new one. I think Dorman. I think I got a Dorman. I don't recall. I have to look. So let's get this thing ready to go onto a stand or something, and we're going to go from there. And I just looked and I realized here's a block dowel here, and this one's here, and the other one stayed in the trans. So it's not a big deal. It doesn't really affect anything, but I just, sometimes you want to make sure that if you're ever dealing with, like, let's say you're replacing a motor, always double check your block dowels, because I've seen it to where a block dowel stays in a block and one of them stays in the tranny. You go to put it together and you lay it down in place, and all of a sudden you're mating them up and you can't figure out why the thing won't go together, and that's because you're trying to butt up two block dowels. So, but I mean, it's not a big deal on this because this motor came out of this vehicle. So, all right, let's just continue and do what we got to do. All right, so there we go. It's off the hoist, and I got it sitting in my roll cart. I got two 4x4 blocks underneath it just to kind of like level it out because the oil pan bottoms out in the roll cart. And I got it supported, and I got it chained to the cart. I got a chain wrapping around it going from the studs in the back just to keep it from flopping one way or the other. It'll be fine. Like I said, there's not a lot of weight to it, but of course when you pull one head off, it's going to be a little unbalanced. So I just want to keep it from possibly hitting the floor, that would just be not good. So I'm going to start ripping this thing apart now and see what we find. All right, so I got the timing covers off now, and there you see the belt and the setup. Customer stated that they had the timing belt changed at some point, but since we were going to do these head gaskets, I told them may as well do it even if it's way before time, because it's just a best idea to do it now. And I could see that the water pump was done, but we're doing that also. But now, if you look at the tensioner, I don't think that's been changed. And I don't think the idlers have been changed. And I want to show you something. If you look up here, you look close, that tensioner, the hydraulic portion, looks like it's leaking. Now, that hydraulics is what keeps tension on the belt. Now check this out. That's like way too loose. That's tight on this side, but that's like too much slop. So the reason I put the harmonic balancer back on is because I got to line up the timing marks before I take this thing apart. Subarus are very particular about that. This mark should be up here. This mark should be right in that seam. And then there is one on the gear down there, which you can't see, but it lines up to a mark up here. Once I get the harmonic balancer back off, you can see that. Because if you put it together wrong, you can actually bolt the heads up and bend the valves as you're bolting the heads up. Ask me how I figured that one out. So, that was a long time ago. Learned my lesson, that's for sure. Thought I knew everything, and I didn't. So, going back together with this now, or coming back apart with this now, and let's keep going. All right, so there we have the marks lined up. See that? You see that? Like I said, that lines up to the casting mark there, where the two halves go together. Now, depending on how you look at it, it could be off slightly. But think about this. A lot of times, even if it looks off a hair, if you try to go one more tooth one way or the other, you're going to be off drastically. So let's get the harmonic balancer off. These are nice. They just slide on and off. But there you see the mark on top lines up with that mark right there. Let's see that little notch right there? And you can see it's off a hair. It's not exactly on, but like I said, if you go one more tooth, you're going to be completely off. So, those are really just a guide. You don't go nuts, thinking that you got to be dead nuts on, because most of the time you're never going to get that. All right, so there we go. We got that stuff off of there. And one thing I wanted to show you on Subarus, when you go to take the tensioner off, you can see it's wet on the inside there, where the hydraulic plunger is. This washer here needs to be there to hold this tensioner in the right position. And what happens, and I've seen it many times, that O-ring disintegrates that holds it in place. It's not there for sealing, it's just to hold it in place, that's all. As you see, it won't fall off that way. But what I've seen is that O-ring disintegrates and that washer falls off. So people mess around with this thing and that washer falls off and it lays down in here or sometimes down in here. And then they go put this thing back on without the washer, not even realizing it was supposed to be there. And they do that, and guess what? Now you got belt noises, something like that. If you don't wind up with a belt noise, you could wind up with a belt skipping at some point, a tooth, because this thing will actually cock the belt off to one side slightly. So instead of the belt riding in the center, as you can actually see the witness marks, it'll be off to one side, and eventually it could walk itself off the edge. So just something to be mindful of. All right, so I got the valve cover off of this one side. And as you can see, if you look down inside the hole, you see oil in there. Now don't mistake oil inside a spark plug tube as, you know, the motor being worn out or something like that. A spark plug actually has oil all over the outside of it. That's fine, but if you look, it's not burning oil or anything. The oil to the outside, and it'll even coat the threads. If you know the whole thing is filled up with oil, you pull it out, it could be dripping with oil. It's not because the motor's shot. It's, if it was dripping oil, you would have seen it out your tailpipe. So, you know, a lot of people mistake that. Just don't do that. So this is just leaking seals. These seals are these are the ones that go on the end of the tube seals there, or end of the spark plug tubes. And these seals are so dried up, they're like a piece of charcoal. So that's the reason for that oil leak. All right, so let's get on with pulling the head off. All right, so here's a good visual. Cylinder head's off. Why do these things leak oil? Okay, let me show you. The head bolts go here, 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 here. There's only 6 head bolts. And this is your oil return right here. That's your oil pressure right there. That's your oil return down there. So your clamping pressure is above where the oil return is. Over time, that area, you know, through heat cycles and everything else, that area is the weakest link, basically. So it winds up leaking. And you can see this goes back down and into the pan and that. There's your water jackets here. And there's the bolts that hold the 2 case halves together. I wanted to point something else out to you. Remember I had the timing marks set to the spot where they want you to line it up. Now, when you line it up like that, you're not on number 1. You notice how the pistons are halfway down? They do that for a reason, so you don't hit the valves. And like I said, I made that mistake myself once, and don't want to ever do that again. So basically, let me show you the head gasket too. And here you see the head gasket. You only got this little thin area here that's going to keep oil from running out, and it doesn't do an extremely good job. So usually it's not because anything warps or whatever. It's just, you know, over time through heat cycles and stuff like that. So all right, let's get this cleaned up. Don't use one of those wizard things on here. Don't ever do that. Use a Scotch-Brite pad. If you can get like a body shop, you can get one of the flat sanders, like or we call them long boards. I don't have one, unfortunately. And then this way you go across it nice and even. You could do that with a very, very fine grit sandpaper. But I'm just going to Scotch-Brite pad these because this thing never overheated, never had an issue like that. It was just an oil leak, really. There was some coolant in there. But I got a funny feeling if you look there, you can kind of see how there was like that, a little bit of a gap in the sealing material there. But there was no coolant mixing. But I did see a little coolant leaking out. Same thing right there. So I got a funny feeling it was something like that and then leaking out and dripping. Because like I said, never mixed with the coolant, with the oil. So, all right, let's go from there. All right, I got both heads off. I flipped this thing on its back. I got the oil pan off. So I got it all cleaned up and ready to go back together. So I'm going to silicone this thing up and bolt it in place. All right, so now that's ready to go back on. Now when I clean this off, just so you know, what I did is I cleaned that surface off with a wire wheel. You don't want to use one of those abrasive discs or whatever because they just gouge the aluminum. That's one thing you do not want to do. So I'm just going to go ahead, throw that on, and throw the bolts in there. All right, so that's it. It's bolted up. I just snugged the screws down. You don't want to go nuts on something that uses silicone like that. And you see it's got like a little bit of squish coming out, which is fine. You don't want to go nuts and have, you know, like an entire tube of silicone hanging out. Just a little squish is fine. And it looks good all the way around. But like I said, what I do is I put the screws in and I just snug them in place. Like just as soon as you feel them starting to get tension on them, I stop. Then when I'm done with everything else I got to do, then I'll maybe go a little bit tighter. But when you're dealing with silicone, that's usually fine. You know, the screws aren't going to fall out. So, all right, that's it. On to the next step. All right, so there we go. I got all my gasket surfaces cleaned up on there. Just to soak up a little extra goo that was falling out of this motor. But everything's all good. I blew out all the hose with holes. And on this side, I blew out all the holes, and I got the gasket sitting on there. Now, these are MLS Felpro gaskets. I do spray them with a coating. They tell you you don't have to, but I do. It's just a extra level of protection. Because like I said, these things are notorious for leaking oil. So, and that's just a little bit down there. That's all it takes, and there you're leaking. So now we're going to take this head first, and we're going to put this one on first, and then set them in place. The head bolts, I oiled them up. I oiled the washers on both sides, so this way they go in nicely. You have to replace the head bolts on these. These are torque to yield, and it's very specific to replace the head bolts. So that's what we did. All right, so let's get this in. All right, so the heads are on. They are torqued, and these bolts, it's the way they have you do this is you torque them down to I don't know, I forgot what the spec is. I just did it and I forgot what it is. It's like 40 and then 70. You do them in order, and then you got to back them off 180, then back them off another 180, and then they have a very specific way of torquing them after that. So that's all done. You do it in steps. The last torque spec is 90 degrees, then 45 degrees, and then the center bolts get 45 on their own. So that's all done. So now I'm going to worry about the timing belt, putting all that stuff on, a new water pump. Actually, I should put a dipstick in right now, and at least this way that part of it's done. So I'm going to try to button up this entire front and get the valve covers back on. This way this part of this is done and ready to go. Oh, and in the back here, let me show you real quick. I'm going to change the rear main seal, and this is that plate. That's a good view of that plate. And like I said, you get the bolts out, however, and that's one specific bolt. You just have to remember that. You get this plate off, it has a tendency to distort, so just replace it. I have a replacement here. I just got to dig it out. I got it in my car, I think. Yeah, that's about it. So let's get going and let's get this done. All right, so the timing belt, water pump, and everything else is in place on that. And one thing I really like that Subaru did is, if you notice, the aftermarket followed suit. The belts actually have marks on them, so you know where it lines up, because sometimes it could be off just a hair. So there, that lines up there, and there that lines up there. So that's all good. Everything's on, everything's tight. If you're ever doing one of these, put this pulley on last. Get the belt on, get your tensioner on. Don't pull a pin on the tensioner, and then put this pulley on once everything else is in place, because otherwise you're going to really fight this thing. Anyway, that's about it for that. So now I'm going to put the front cover on, and actually valve covers on first, and then the front covers, and then it'll be ready to go back in the vehicle. Actually, no, I still got to do the rear cover. So let's do that first. All right, so here you see I got that cover off, and it's just, I guess it's an access port for whatever that plug is for. I have no idea. I've never split a case on one of these things. As you can see, there's a seam that runs down the center there, because you have two case halves. Anyway, so there's the old one right there, and the silicone that's on it just gets totally dried up and it starts leaking. But like I said, when you pry these off, they get deformed, so they want you to replace them. It's a single use only, and they have an arrow on there, and I thought I knew the reason for it. Like there was a special bolt, but the special bolt is the same as all the other bolts. It's just black where the other ones are silver, and I'm not quite sure as to why. It's here somewhere. Here it is. See, it's a black bolt, where all the other ones are silver in color, but it's the same depth, the same everything. Now, when you go to take them out, I had a heck of a time getting them out, so I wound up using an impact driver, one of these bad boys with an adapter and this little shorty Allen on there. So the new cover comes with those new Allen bolts. So just put some silicone on it, and I'm going to bolt that in place. All right, so there you see a little bit of silicone on there. It's just a very light layer. I don't go crazy, and it'll squish out nicely. And I did clean that surface with Scotch-Brite pad and a little bit of brake clean. Got it nice and clean. All right, guys, so the motor is back in place. Basically, I just laid it in place. The studs down there, I slid those through. I had a helper here that showed up, so that's kind of why I wasn't filming. I just kind of like lost track and got the motor in place. It's very simple. There I caught a couple of the bell housing bolts, and there you can see the flywheel. Now, even though you don't have to, I always mark the flywheel and torque converter if I can, to try to put it back in the same orientation. You don't have to, but there you can see the torque converter does move freely. Whenever you're putting a motor and tranny in and together, make sure that your torque converter is rotating freely as it's going together, because otherwise you could bind something up and you could possibly break the pump in the tranny. Don't want to do that. So basically it's all just reassembly at this point. Nothing spectacular, so I'm going to reassemble it. If I come across anything that I feel is a good hitting point to talk about, or whatever, then I'll cover that. But right now I don't think there really is. It's just assembly. All right, yeah, so that's it. So let me keep going with this and see how we do. All right, so it's all together. Only thing left is I actually got to put coolant in it. I always start these things up first before I put coolant in it, because for a while there I was having an issue with, I'd put everything together, put coolant in it, and find out I forgot something and have to take something apart and drain the coolant out anyway. So I got to the habit of, let me start it up first, make sure it runs. Yeah, that was years ago, but I just got in the habit, and it's been like that ever since. So let's see. I will take that. We got no check engine light, that's perfect. Tire light flashing, but I think there was codes beforehand. I'll have to check. I wrote everything down. That's one thing I do. I actually check for codes before I do anything, especially a job this big, because you know what? I want to know if there's codes in it beforehand. This way a customer can't say to me later on, oh, I never had a check engine light, or I never had that code before. I want to know about it first. I want to verify it. So let me shut this off real quick. All right, obviously I don't want to let it get hot, since it has zero coolant in it. So now I can fill out the cooling system, and I am done. That's a job well done. I like these things. Anyway, that's about it. So if you're getting anything out of my videos, hit the like button. If you could, please subscribe. That should be about it. If you want to join our Facebook group called Backyard Mechanics, please do so. Make sure you answer all the questions and do not block your profile. That's about it. So hope you guys got something out of this. Have a great day. Keep wrenching.